The 2024 Mets did not open their season looking like a team on the rise. They looked like a team in trouble. The losses came early, the questions came quickly, and in New York, where every bad stretch feels even worse, it started to feel like this season might slip away before it ever had a chance to become something special. It was the kind of start that tests a ball club, tests its confidence, tests its patience, and tests the faith of everyone watching. But baseball has a funny way of changing the story. Because just when it looked like the Mets were running out of answers, they found a spark. And that spark came from Jose Iglesias. He didn't just bring a bat. He didn't just bring a glove. He brought energy. He brought belief. He brought life. And before long, he brought something else. OMG. What started as a song became a rallying cry. What started as a rough season suddenly had a new sound, a new feeling, a new identity. The club that looked buried early started playing with confidence, with swagger, and with joy. The bad start was still part of the story, but it wasn't the whole story anymore. Now there was momentum. Now there was belief. Now there was a team that felt alive. That was the real story of the 2024 Mets. The rough beginning, the unexpected spark, the song that became a symbol, and the season that found its voice. That was reality. Now let's talk replay. This is the Tabletop Sportcast. Welcome in, everybody, and thank you for joining me for another episode of the Tabletop Sportcast, where we talk sports board games, sports sims, and the stories we create with them. I'm your host, James Cast, and this week we're diving into a replay retrospective in episode 245. I'm taking a look back at my 2024 Mets replay, where I used History Maker Baseball, and comparing it to the real-life season, and talking through what worked, what didn't, and what I'd do differently the next time around. Because that's one of the great things about a replay project. When it's over, you don't just have a final record sitting on a spreadsheet somewhere. You've got a season to reflect on. You've got choices you made as a manager. You've got players who surprised you, players who disappointed you, and moments that made the replay feel like it took on a life of its own. And in this case, the Mets gave me plenty to think about. Before we get there, though, I want to look back just for a moment at last week's episode 244, when replays feel like a classic mixtape. That episode was really about the way we build replay projects out of memory, feeling, and personal connection. Not necessarily trying to create a greatest hits package and not trying to invent something entirely new, but instead taking pieces of a real season, a real era, a real sports memory, and arranging them into something that feels meaningful to us as gamers. And honestly, this Mets replay fits that idea pretty well. Because yes, I was replaying the 2024 Mets. Yes, I wanted to see how closely the game might track to reality. But at the same time, this was also my version of that season. My choices, my lineup decisions, my use of the roster, my management style, my experience of seeing that Mets team unfold on the tabletop. So in a lot of ways, this week's episode feels like a natural follow-up to last week's conversation. Today, I'll break down how close the replay came to the real Mets, where it matched up, where it drifted, which players defined the season for me, and what this project taught me about both the team and the way I handle a full season replay. But before we get to the main topic, let's hit into Around the Table. All right, Around the Table, my personal gaming highlight. Let's start there. This week, I was able to get a couple of matches in with Legends of Wrestling from Phil Singer Games. I rolled up Jimmy Snuka versus Ted DiBiase, and then followed that with Randy, the Macho Man Savage, taking on Nikolai Volkov. And in both cases, the fan favorites came through, with Snuka and Savage getting the wins. This was just a fun little trip into another wrestling era. And even with only 2 matches, it's one of those games that instantly creates a vibe. You can picture the entrances, you can hear the crowd, and you can start imagining where those results might go if you build them into like a larger card or full territory. So I had a lot of fun with that game. On the hobby news front, this was also a really good week, or it's going to be a good month too, I'll add, especially if you are into March Madness, because I think we've got a couple of releases that really almost feel like a March Madness tribute. First, we'll start with the release of the College Playdown set from Play Games. So this is a fictional college basketball universe that lets you do more than just jump right into a 64-team tournament. They had released that a couple of years ago. They've reskinned those 64 teams and then also added a bunch of other teams to this. And you can help play out the entire conference schedule, which is really crazy. You can play all the conference schedules. You have the entire fictional college basketball universe on your table. So that just opens us up to like a much bigger college basketball experience than just the bracket itself. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about that set because we'll probably get into that in much greater detail over on the Play Nation podcast, my other podcast that I do with Al Wilson and Harvey Couch. We're going to get into that in our next episode when we sit down with Keith Avalone. But that release definitely caught my attention. And then right alongside that, we also got the rules release for the upcoming matchup basketball game. This is ST Patrick's latest game release. And if you're a basketball fan, it really does feel like kind of a 2-course meal right now. On one side, you've got the Play fictional college universe. And on the other side, you've got a whole new basketball design starting to show its hand. And that one's got me really excited to get it to the table. He's going to cover both college and pros, and if his college football game, and really his football game is any indicator, this is going to be a nice treatment of the college game, something that's usually missing from a lot of the games that do get released. A lot of our tabletop games tend to focus on the pro games with the college games as an afterthought. And I think ST has proven with his college football universe that he can capture the college game in such a way, and I'm hoping it will translate over to basketball as well. And actually, that's a nice segue into the last part here of our Around the Table, because recently, just in the last couple of weeks, we had the release of Sports Sim Magazine issue number 22. And there's quite a bit of stuff in this issue, so I think we're going to find, this is what happens every time, right? This magazine always gives you just a nice mix of commentary on our hobby, design discussion about games, feature writing, and then usually some playable extras. So let's start with the cover story. This quarter's cover story is an article by Eric Simon called Play at the Races, and that's a strong feature article because it's not just praise and it's not just criticism. It's actually a really good analysis piece. Eric really talks about how the game blends the horse and the jockey attributes. It's using early and late ratings, pace profiles, and the jockey ratings to create some drama and decision-making. He also points to the way Keith Avalone has generated chip economy and duel mechanics into that final furlong as features that really help create tension and bring the races to life. But at the same time, he also notes some of the simplifications that the design has made. And so it sounds like he's really done a nice job in the article and writes it as a thoughtful, here's what this game is doing well, and here's what it chooses to abstract kind of piece. Next article I'm going to highlight is my article. I wrote the article, The Road to 3000. And this was a piece of me looking back on what became a much bigger hobby project than I really ever expected when I first started tracking sessions back in September of 2020. In the article, I just talk about reaching 3,098 sessions at that point in time, over 1,888 days, meaning I averaged just over 1.5 sessions per day. I played 129 different games during that time, 97 of which were sports titles. But the real heart of that article is the idea of kind of my core engine and the fact that there were just 8 games that accounted for 54% of all of my sessions. So for me, the article isn't just a bunch of numbers. It's really about what keeps bringing certain games back to the table and why some designs become the backbone of how we game. You can't get through a sports sim magazine without some feature articles by S.T. Patrick, and on his side, one article that really stands out is Get Your Group On. I think it's a timely topic because it looks at this idea of hobby fragmentation. We've got all these different Facebook groups. We've got these smaller communities. We have some niche spaces. And he's asking the question if that's actually a bad thing. His basic takeaway seems to be that no, this is probably what growth looks like. Different groups serve different purposes. And even if not all of them will last, the fact that so many people are trying to connect and share their projects and build hobby communities is ultimately a positive sign. And then another article that ST has contributed this quarter is Matchup Basketball, a first look. And this one especially caught my eye because, as I mentioned, I'm excited about this new game. So the mechanical preview sounds really interesting. He's got a pace-based system that really helps distinguish the styles of teams. And there's also a substitution light approach where the game is handling a lot of the player involvement for you instead of making you manually micromanage every lineup change. And that kind of goes back to the topic that we had covered a couple of episodes ago about managing playing time in basketball games. So I think very similar to how he handled it in his football game, he has figured out a way to do that with basketball too, so that you don't have to be micromanaging everything. That sounds really promising to me because I think basketball games sometimes get you bogged down if they ask too much from the coach. So this sounds like it's really trying to keep the flow of the sport intact. And then speaking of design articles, there's another one I'd like to point out to one of our former guests, John Turnbull, who wrote an article about red ice hockey. I always enjoy when we get to kind of see that pullback of the curtain on design. And this one looks at the creation of his quick play hockey game. It's that sort of behind the scenes design thinking that I think is always fun to read. And especially when it's tied to a sport that can be hard to simulate well in a short format. And then there's one more article that I wanted to mention, and it is called Brain Checking into the Boards. And it's part one of a discussion about mental health and the hobby. And I think it's always important anytime a magazine like this makes room for something beyond the mechanics and the replay projects. This hobby is obviously about games, but it's also about community, routine, creativity, and sometimes even comfort. So seeing an issue make room for that kind of conversation is really a good thing. I mentioned early on some freebies. So what we got in issue 22 includes 8 more pentathletes for the pentathlon version of the decathlon game by Tom McHugh. And then we've also got a downhill skiing Cortina 2026, women's downhill skiing Cortina 2026, created by S.T. Patrick. So that kind of gets you a chance to really try something out from the Winter Olympics that just wrapped up. I think that was pretty cool that ST included something seasonal and timely in there as a freebie. And, once again, one of these issues where you're not just getting reading material, you're also getting a couple of things you can actually print and play. And so that's pretty much our full trip around the table this week. A little classic wrestling action, a pair of basketball games that are being developed and released this month, just in time for March Madness, and then a strong issue of Sports Sim magazine with plenty to read and a couple of freebies to try. And with that, let's get into today's main topic. All All right, so as we mentioned, we're going to talk about the 2024 Mets replay because this is exactly the kind of replay I love looking back on. On the surface, the headline says I got extremely close. My replay Mets finished 88 and 74, while the real 2024 Mets finished 89 and 73. And the really wild part is that the real Mets Pythagorean record was 88 and 74, which means my replay basically landed right on their expected record. So that's a really terrific kind of big picture result for a full season replay. My record matched up with the real season record. And some people might look at that and say, well, what's the point of playing it if you're just going to end up at the same place? Well, if you look underneath that record, the replay and the real Mets were not identical twins. They were more like cousins who got to the same neighborhood by taking different roads. In my replay, the Mets scored 682 runs and allowed 628. In real life, they scored 768 and allowed 697. So my replay offense came in 86 runs light, while the pitching and run prevention were 69 runs better. So that means the replay version of my New York Mets were a lower scoring, better pitching team than the real club. The record was almost identical. The identity was not. And honestly, that's where this retrospective gets interesting, because some of those differences were not random. Some of them were shaped by the way I managed the replay. So let's start with what went well. One thing that clearly went well was my decision to use History Maker Baseball rules aggressively, especially when it came to full star players. Now, setting the table here, a full star player in History Maker Baseball generally has 90 to 95 games played as a batter, and usually 20 games pitched as a pitcher. So that provides a little bit of flexibility. If you're looking to grow the role of somebody, you can play within that. Full half-star players typically have between 50 and 90 games played as a batter or 10 and 20 games pitched as a pitcher. So knowing that, I really leaned into that, and my best example of that is David Peterson. In real life, Peterson made 21 starts. He qualified as a full starter. In my replay, he made 32 starts. And yeah, that's a huge jump. But honestly, it's a decision I would absolutely make again. The game gives you the tools, and part of the fun of a replay is deciding how hard to push those tools. Peterson became a much bigger part of my season, and he rewarded me with that trust. He finished the replay at 16-10 with a 2.86 ERA, striking out 187 batters in 201.1 innings. He became one of the defining success stories of the entire project. That same idea showed up with the core position players. Francisco Lindor still felt like the engine of his team. In my replay, he played all 162 games, just like he did in real life. He hit 282, he scored 91 runs, he hit 26 home runs, he drove in 78, and he stole 50 bases. But it wasn't the exact same shape as the real season. Yet, he still felt like the guy everything ran through. What I got was a version of Francisco Lindor who came up a little bit shorter in the power numbers, contributed a little bit more with the base running. Mark Vientos was another big win. And in his case, almost came out like pretty close here. He finished with 28 home runs. That was the most on the team. And he posted an 802 OPS in just 107 games. That's a breakout replay season any Mets fan would take. And it was pretty close to the breakout season he had in real life, too. And then finally, Jose Iglesias, who we talked about at the beginning. He became one of the coolest surprises of the replay. He ended up hitting .347 in 99 games and turned into one of the most reliable bats on the team. And honestly, that's the role he played in real life, too. And when you think about how important his real-life emergence was to the vibe of the 2024 Mets, it was pretty satisfying to see him become a more meaningful part of the replay as well. On the mound, as we talked about, this team became a much better pitching team. I had Sean Manaea. He came through as kind of a true frontline piece. He went 14-8 with a 3.15 ERA, giving the replay staff another stabilizing force. And honestly, his numbers, innings pitched, ERA, win-loss, was almost spot on to what he had in real life. But then you got into somebody who really outdid himself, and that was Edwin Diaz, our kind of like absolute monster closer who finished the season with 47 saves and a 0.98 ERA. And when the Mets had a lead late, the game was basically over. And that was really interesting because he, in real life, had finished with just 20 saves and like a 3.52 ERA. So he really kind of outdid himself. And that's what's going to happen. You're going to have some of those success stories where people just kind of beat the odds. And he was one of those folks that did that. And so when I look at what went well, I think the replay absolutely captured the Mets as a competitive, interesting club. The final record was right there. The key players still mattered. And a few of them, especially Peterson and Diaz, became major success stories because of how I chose to manage the team. So then, what didn't go well? I think the biggest offensive issue was one I created myself: lineup shape. I built my own Mets lineup, and I went for a front-loaded part of the lineup. I started my lineup at the beginning, Vientos leading off, followed by Lindor, Alvarez, Alonso. That was my front four there. And I clearly front-loaded the danger. I stacked some of my best bats near the top, trying to maximize offense early in the order. On paper, that made sense. But looking back, I may have actually hurt the overall offense because I didn't create enough balance throughout the lineup. Once you got past the top section, the order may have thinned out too much. So even though I was trying to optimize offense, I may actually have made the lineup easier to pitch to over the course of a full game. And I think the team level scoring supports that. The replay Mets scored 86 runs fewer than the real team. That's not like a little drift. That's a real shortfall. A big part of that may have been my willingness to keep players like Harrison Bader in the lineup for his glove. And there were definitely games when that defense mattered. But over a long season, I probably needed to be more willing to trade some of his defense for some more offense. And at times, I think I stayed loyal to defense-first players even when the lineup needed more juice. That doesn't mean playing those guys was a mistake. It means playing them as often as I did may have come with a bigger offensive price tag than I was fully acknowledging in the moment. Another big piece of this is Pete Alonso. In my replay, he only played 141 games. He hit 24 home runs, drove in 63, and finished at a .210 batting average with a .640 OPS. Way underneath the actual production he was able to provide. Because I was using the actual game day results, he had a couple of injuries. One of them kept him out for 15 to 20 games. So he ended up playing like 20, 21 games less than what he had done in real life. In like real life, he played every single game. That left his power numbers well short. He only had 24 home runs versus like 30 plus in real life. Only drove in 63 when he was above 90 in real life. And instead of hitting like closer to 240, he only hit like 210. So as much as I got a bump from Edwin Diaz, I saw a real blow to my offensive output with Pete Alonso just not coming up. And it really happened a lot. You know, I think he was a semi home run king. He just got bad die rolls. Like decider dies just were not landing in his favor throughout the whole season. So, I think it's important to separate two things here. Some of this is just performance level, right? The randomness caused me to kind of lose Pete Alonso's performance, his availability. But in my replay, it was important that the Mets had to deal with injuries. Meanwhile, my opponents that I was facing, they were almost always coming in clean. Rested bullpens, full roster, no carryover fatigue, no real wear and tear from the previous series. What I did use was their actual as-played lineups, so if a player wasn't in the full lineup, he didn't get a chance to start. But I would have those guys available to make pinch hitting appearances. I didn't keep anybody out just because they weren't in the as-played lineup. So my Mets, they had to absorb the cost of randomness. The opponents didn't. That creates that replay environment that doesn't completely mirror real life. So that leaves us in kind of a place where this replay sat in this kind of interesting middle ground. It's grounded in the real life structure, but my own strategic flexibility kind of got layered on top. And then here's another statistical clue that we saw in the close games. My replay Mets went 31-31 in one-run games. In real life, they were 28-16. This team, because I wasn't scoring as many runs, ended up playing a lot more baseball on the knife's edge. They lived in close games, and they broke even in them. That fits with the bigger picture, right? Lower run scoring, more pressure innings, less margin for error. But this team just didn't have as much of an easier time in those close games as the real-life counterparts did. So let's look at what I would do differently next time. And the first thing is I would definitely still use the game's tools aggressively. I would still push for those full star players. I would still let a guy like David Peterson become more important if the replay is willing to tell me he deserves it. There was a lot to that too, right? Like, because I was able to get him to go an additional 11 starts, that kept bad starters from getting in the mix more often. I didn't have to go to guys who made 1 or 2 starts who weren't very good. That helped bring that pitching performance into a much better place. I was able to rely on those top starters a little bit more. I was able to rely on my top bullpen guys a little bit more. I didn't use 30 or 40 pitchers to get through that season like they did in real life. I used, maybe 15, 16 pitchers to get through the entire season. Big difference. Big difference. So that part works, and I would absolutely do that again. But I would probably think harder about my lineup balance. Not just the lineup strength, but the lineup balance. I would still want to put my best hitters near the top. I think everybody does. But I don't want to create an order that falls off too sharply. I think next time I'd pay more attention to how the lineup works from spots 5 through 8, not just how dangerous the top looks. A place where this really showed up was Brandon Nimmo. Brandon Nimmo's final numbers were almost spot on to where he was in real life, from a batting average, OPS, home runs, almost identical, right? He's one of those guys that you looked at and you're like, yep, the replay worked. His RBI totals were about 2/3 of what they were in real life. And it's because he was hitting in the back part of the order and just wasn't having the same contribution that he had playing more towards the top of the order or the middle of the order like he had in real life. So that's something I would definitely look at, is the lineup construction. The next thing I would do is I'd be much more intentional about situational offense versus defensive value. A player like Harrison Bader can absolutely help you win games. He was a gold center fielder that came in huge across the board. But over the course of a full season replay, I needed to be more honest about when I needed run production and when I could afford to lean on the glove first players. His offense was now nowhere near where it had been in real life, and I needed to get more offense at times. Last thing I would probably do differently also is I would definitely think harder about the simulation environment itself. If my Mets are dealing with injuries, fatigue, and bullpen wear, but the opponent is always walking in fresh, it kind of changes the ecosystem of the replay. And I don't necessarily know that that's if there's a perfect fix for that, but it is something I would definitely want to account for more consciously next time around. So my bottom line takeaway is this: the replay was a success, but it was also a revealing success. I got the record almost exactly right. I got the feel of the key guys like Lindor, Manaea, Vientos, Iglesias, and Peterson. I got those guys right. I made at least one aggressive management choice with Peterson that I would absolutely repeat, but I also learned that my lineup design probably cost me offense, and that my loyalty to defense created some dead spots in the order and that the structure of the replay kind of quietly tilted the difficulty level if only one side is truly feeling the wear and tear of the season. But honestly, that's what makes a retrospective worth doing. Not just asking how close was I, but asking why did my replay become its own version of the Mets? So before I wrap up our main topic, I do want to hit on kind of one more fun piece of this replay. And this is my top 10 lists of those replay-only highlights. These are not about what happened in real life. These are about what happened on my tabletop. So at number 10, Jose Iglesias turning into the unlikely batting star. I mean, it wasn't that unlikely. He was a batting star in real life too. But I think one of the coolest replay surprises was Iglesias hitting 347 for 99 games and him not just filling in, because when people were hurt, he was my key guy, being somebody who could play across the infield. But he became one of my most reliable hitters. Number 9, the Mets absolutely owned Miami. My replay Mets went 12-1 against the Marlins. And that became one of the clear team storylines of the whole season. At number 8, Francisco Lindor was still the heartbeat of this team. He played in all 162 games and put together that huge all-around season. Power, speed, driving in runs, scoring runs, it was all there. And as we mentioned earlier, number 7, Mark Vientos had his breakout power season. Just like in real life, Mark Vientos delivered. He had a couple of injuries, right? Now, he was going to be eligible for me to play a full season. I was interested to see, what will he look like for a full season? But those injuries ended up bringing him back down to playing 107 games. In real life, he played 111. So that part of the injury work kind of got him back to the same place that he was supposed to be at from the beginning. At number 6, another one we talked about earlier, Edwin Diaz was lights out. I mean, 47 saves and a 0.98 ERA might be a case enough to say that this guy had a shot at being like the MVP for this team in this season. At number 5, my rotation looked more like 1986 than 2024 because it logged 9 complete games, which gave my season kind of that old school feel and helped define this team as like a pitching first club. Now you might say 2024, you probably shouldn't have had as many complete games. Well, again, I leaned into the rules of History Maker Baseball. I used the freshness rules, 3 fresh, 3, semi-fresh. That might have given everybody a little bit more innings, but I also realized I needed to manage my bullpen. And there were times where if the Mets were up big, and it was an 8-2 game, I just let the starter stay in. I was like, you might as well get the innings now instead of me having to use guys out of the bullpen. So that was one thing that I had done. As long as they were still looking like they could extend it. And there was a lot of times that they were either chasing shutouts or, the game was just a blowout. And it was like, you can get the innings now. And I took advantage of that, more like an old school season than maybe it would have played out in 2024. Number 4, David Peterson became the true ace. He wasn't just good. I mean, he became a pillar of the entire replay. And yeah, he did end up playing a lot more than he did in real life. 32 starts instead of 21, 16 wins, 2.86 ERA, 187 strikeouts. The 201 innings, I think he had really 120 in real life. So his 80-plus innings kept a lot of bad pitchers off the mound for that team too. My number 3 highlight, the Mets getting a 9-game winning streak from May 17th through May 26th, 9 in a row. And that stretch really felt like the momentum, the replay team kind of announced itself as a real contender. At number 2, probably the biggest single game lopsided score that we had, we demolished the White Sox 17-1 on August 30th. 17-1. Pete Alonso, who had a horrible season, I mean, it was awful, had a huge day that day. He drove in 7 runs, hit 2 home runs, and it was one of those games. Paul Blackburn made a spot start, and I just had him go the distance. He pitched a complete game. I mean, what's the point? Why would bring in anybody else? Here's a guy who I called up just to make that start, and it was like, you're out there until we need to pull you in. In a 17-1 game, there was never a time where he needed to be pulled. That's the kind of box score you kind of remember instantly. But my number 1 highlight for the entire season, David Peterson's masterpiece against Washington. It was July 1st, and it was a 7-1 final, but David Peterson went the distance, allowing no hits. Yep, I got my no-hitter. He struck out 13 in the game as well. So you want to, it was a no-hitter. He gave up the one unearned run thanks to an error, but it had to be like the pitching performance of the season. It was kind of our signature replay moment, right? I mean, those are the highlights you always hope to have happen as you're going through a replay. And I was able to get it as part of this season. And, a great, icing on the top of the cake for David Peterson. Had a great season and ended up getting a no-hitter in the process. So those are my top 10 highlights from this 2024 Mets replay. The moments that belong to this tabletop season, and mostly this tabletop season alone. You heard a couple that were probably carryovers from the real life Mets too. All right, let's come back and wrap up today's episode. Yep, that'll do it for this week's episode. And as I look back on the 2024 Mets replay using History Maker Baseball, I think my biggest takeaway is this. The project did what a good replay is supposed to do. It gave me a season that felt recognizable, but not identical. The final record came in almost right on top of reality, and the key players still emerged in meaningful ways. Yet the path that this replay took had its own personality. And that's really what this retrospective was about. We talked about what went well, things like capturing the Mets as a competitive, interesting club. I got strong seasons from the key pieces of guys like, Lindor, Vientos, and especially David Peterson, who became just a major part of the project because of the way I chose to manage the full star rules. What didn't go well was my offense. The replay lagged behind the real team. And a lot of that seems tied to the choices that I made. I front-loaded the lineup. I probably didn't get creative enough. I didn't create enough balance. I stuck with the glove-first players in spots where I may have needed more offense. And on top of that, the Mets had to deal with the injuries while the opponents I faced were almost always coming in fresh and fully stocked, which created kind of a replay environment that didn't completely mirror real life. And then maybe the most important question of what I would do differently next time, I think I'd still be aggressive with the tools, as I mentioned. I'd pay more attention, though, to that lineup balance, the role usage, and the overall ecosystem of the replay. Because when you finish one of these projects, it's not just about whether the stats match, it's about what the season taught you. Now, one thing I'll mention before I close this out. I did complete the regular season, but I have not tackled the postseason, at least not yet. That might be a project for another date, but for me, that wasn't really the story I was trying to tell here. This project was about the regular season journey. It was about taking the 2024 Mets team, putting it on the table, and seeing how the long grind of the season played out through my decisions, my management style, and the game engine itself. But if I'm being honest, there's also another layer to that. Because as I was replaying 2024, the 2025 Mets season was unfolding in real time, and for me, it just didn't seem to have quite the same magic as the year before. And that made this replay even more interesting because it let me spend more time with a Mets team that had a more memorable feel to it, a team with more personality, more swing, more identity. So in some ways, this replay wasn't just about the results. It was also about revisiting a season that felt worth revisiting. Now, if you'd like to reach out, you can always find me through the usual channels. You can email the show at tabletopsportcast@gmail.com. Connect with me on Facebook at facebook.com/tabletopsportcast. Check out the content on YouTube. We're starting to get the podcast episodes on there. And you can always support the show through Patreon, patreon.com/tabletopsportcast, where $1 a month goes a long way to helping to offset costs for the podcasts. However you follow along, I always appreciate you being part of the Tabletop Sportcast community. Coming up next week, it'll be episode 246, which I'm titling Stop the Slop. That episode is going to feature on the growing role that AI is starting to play in our hobby, and more importantly, the pitfalls of embracing it too casually. because AI can be a useful tool. And I think that's pretty clear, but only if we're willing to hold it to a high standard. And too often the temptation is to use it because it's fast, because it's easy, or because it fills space. But that doesn't automatically make the end result good. So Stop the Slop is really about setting a higher bar for the content we create and share using AI. And if these tools are going to become part of the hobby, they are, and they're going to be a very big part of it. And the expectation has to be that they help us produce better work, not just work. Thanks for being part of the hobby. As always, keep those dice rolling and those cards flipping. This is the Tabletop Sportcast. I'm James Cast. And until next time, thanks for listening.